We are going to go through the questions for history paper 2 and try to do a discussion on the intended responses for the given questions. So as usual, you understand our paper is always out of 150 marks, which comes in the form of either you answer 2 source-based questions and 1 essay, or you answer 1 essay question, or you answer 2 essay questions and 1 source-based questions. Out of the 6 questions, 3 source-based questions and 3 essay questions. Right. Checking on our sections, we see our question number 1 is civil resistance in the 1970s to the 1980s. And our focus there will be the crisis of apartheid. We'll be looking at the different formations that were put in place by Black South Africans to try and challenge apartheid. Then question number 2 is focusing on the coming of democracy to South Africa. We're looking at events after independence, where we focus on the TRC. And question number 3 is the end of the Cold War and a new world order after the collapse of the USSR, events after 1989. Right, then our essay questions is civil resistance in 1970s to 1980s. Our focus there will be Black consciousness movement. Then our question number 5 is the coming of democracy to South Africa and coming to terms with the past. And our focus there will be looking at the negotiation process that brought a democratic South Africa in 1994. Then question number 6 is again the end of Cold War, which is end of world Cold War and the coming of a new world order, the events of 1989, the coming of Mikhail Gorbachev after the fall of the USSR. Right. So we are going to focus on our civil resistance, and also we are going to focus on the coming of democracy. And we are going to look at also the civil resistance as a part of the Black consciousness movement. Right, we move on to our questions. We do not need to waste much time. Right, we understand your focus areas when you're looking at internal or civil resistance. When you're looking at the source-based question, you must know your areas of focus, the possible areas that are examinable as source-based questions for your essay section of question number 1, which is the civil resistance. There's different formations of civil resistance that were enacted in South Africa. Right, this question you see is focusing on the Black Sash. It's looking at the Black Sash. That is your focus area, the Black Sash. So it's not only the Black Sash which is examinable, there are also other areas which are examinable under that topic of internal resistance. There are other sections examinable, like for example, the United Democratic Front, the UDF. And we know well that the UDF was apparently banned, was put on restrictions by the apartheid government because of its activities. It gave birth to the mass democratic movement. It's also another examinable area. Then we can also focus on the civic organizations. It's also another area of concern, the role of civic organizations. Then we can also look at the role of the end conscription campaign. Then also inclusive of the Black Sash. Those are some of the areas that you can check and that you need to be familiar with, and you need to get yourself familiar to, because they are the examinable areas, and in any particular point in time, they can change the area of focus and give any question based on among some of those different forms of internal resistance to apartheid. Right, so our focus is the Black Sash. Just giving you a brief explanation to the formation of the Black Sash. This is one of the oldest organizations, formed as early as 1955. And it was an organization which was formed to fight against the injustice of apartheid. And it was a white organization which was formed by white women. Their main concern was the welfare of the black society. They were so much worried about how the black people were disadvantaged because of the practice of apartheid. So they were trying to come out with measures to try and have their voice heard so that the apartheid government would relax some of the conditions which were unfavorable for the development of the black community, especially the welfare of the black community. So they were wearing the black sashes to represent the morning of the South African Constitution. And they were doing as they were engaged in peaceful protests, whereby they would do vigils, where the parliamentarians will be discussing key issues about South Africa's future. They will do the vigils. They will just go and stand outside the buildings to show their involvement and their concern. So that was basically how they were operating. And also they were trying to give advice, legal advice to the black society. They had offices whereby they were giving legal advice to the black society. And also they were trying to tackle issues involving welfare of the black society in the black communities. Right, basically that was the focus of the Black Sash as an organization, which was there to try and challenge apartheid. Right, let's go to our focus area. How effective were the strategies of the Black Sash in mobilizing against the apartheid regime in 1980s? Right, that is your focus for the question. And remember, when you are looking at the focus of the question, you must also take note that the same focus is the same focus for the paragraph question, for the last question of your source-based question. So as you're going through your sources, you also need to extract and highlight information that answers that particular question, because that is going to be your paragraph question at the end of your source-based question. Your 8-mark question will be based on the focus area of the question. So the question is saying, how effective were the strategies of the Black Sash? We want to analyze the effectiveness of the strategies that were put in place by the Black Sash. Were they successful? To what extent were they successful? What did they do? How can we be sure that they succeeded? What were the positive results that they realized from their intentions of resisting against the rule of apartheid? Right. So let's look at our first question. Our first question is based on source 1A. We also need to look at the context of our sources. Right, the context of our source is saying the extract below, taken from an article titled The Conscience of White South Africa, Celebrating the Black Sash 60 Years Later, written by T-Man M. A journalist, appeared in the Daily Maverick newspaper on 14 May 2015. Right, it focuses on the formation and the strategies of the Black Sash. The formation and the strategies of the Black Sash. That is the focus area for our source. So we cannot go through the source. Our focus is just to answer the questions and also to guide you on how you can extract information that will help you answer the question, and also how you can contextualize your arguments to answer a specific or some specific set of questions that will be posed on you to answer. Right, so we check on the first question. According to the source, what action by the apartheid government led to the establishment of the Black Sash in 1955? So this is a level 1 question, an extraction question. We must not be struggling to find the answer because it's an extraction question, which implies that the answer is already provided in the source. We only need to go to the source and find where to get the answer from. It's saying according to the source. So if we go to our source, we want to identify the action that was taken by the apartheid government that led to the formation of the Black Sash. It says the Black Sash started on 19 May 1955 over a cup of tea by 6 middle-class white, outraged or angered by then government attempts at removing colored citizens from the voters' roll. That is where we get our answer there. We are seeing a situation here. The then government attempts at removing colored citizens from the voters' roll. So that was the motive of the development of the Black Sash. Their initial idea was to challenge the government's attempt to remove colored people from the voters' roll. That was the initial idea behind the formation of the Black Sash, as we are seeing from our source. Right, going to the next question. Define the term voters' roll. What is a voters' roll? Right, when you're defining concepts, what we need there is for you to address the basic concept. You might not define it the same way it is in the textbook. But when you're looking at a voter's roll, we are saying a voter's roll is an official document. What does it serve? It's an official document with a list of people. A list of people who are eligible to vote or who are registered to vote. So we are seeing a situation here in that official document. It's an official governmental document whereby they enlist people who are eligible to vote, people who are supposed to participate in the voting process. We remember during apartheid, it was not everyone who was supposed to vote. Remember, black people did not have a right to vote. So it meant that their names were excluded in the voters' roll. Their names were non-appearing in the voters' roll. And for that matter, in the Cape region, we understand the government was allowing some colored people to participate in the elections. So for that reason, the government attempted to remove them from the official document. They were planning to remove their names from that voters' roll, which is the official document, which has got a list of people who are eligible to vote or who are registered to vote. Right, that's the voters' roll. Right, moving on to the next question. Our next question, it says, name and two women in the source who launched the Women's Defense of the Constitution League, or the Black Sash, in 1955. This is also an extraction question. We are supposed to find the names of those women in the source. It talks about Jean Sinclair, talks about Ruth Philly, talks about Elizabeth McLaren, talks about Tasha Pipers, talks about Jean Bossas, talks about Helen Newton Thompson. These were the women involved in the formation of the Women's Defense of the Constitution League. So you check, there is one figure, the second figure is there, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, a list of 6. You just extract what the question requires. The question is requiring any 2. So any 2 from those 6, they qualify to be correct responses. Right, moving on to the next question, number 1.14. Using the information in the source and your own knowledge, explain why the national regime disliked the Black Sash. Why did they hate the Black Sash? Right. From the onset of the formation, the Black Sash was against. From the onset of its formation, why was it formed? It was against exclusion of colors from voters' roll. From the voters' roll. Which meant that the Black Sash was apparently challenging apartheid. The government is planning to remove colored people from the voters' roll. At the same time, the Black Sash is opposing that. So it was hated for that reason of opposing that idea. And we can also say it was hated by the apartheid regime. It was disliked by the apartheid regime because of generally it was challenging apartheid practices. Or you can say it was against segregation practices. It was fighting against segregatory practices, which were a norm of the apartheid government. So which meant it was going against the will of the government. Or we can say it was representing the rights of Africans. The fact that it was advocating for fair treatment of Africans, it also made it become disliked by um, the apartheid regime. Or we can also say it was hated because it was assisting towards black people's welfare. We know well that the apartheid government was against the realization of the rights of the black man. They were adopting a policy of separate development. They were not worried about what was happening in the African communities. But however, the Black Sash was against such ideas. So, for those reasons, it became an enemy of the operation of the apartheid regime. Because whatever it was doing, it was showing a direct challenge to the reforms that were being introduced by the apartheid government. But we are not saying our responses are limited to that. Any other reasonable response that you can find as a justified response to why the apartheid regime disliked the Black Sash qualifies to be equally a correct response to the question. Right, we move on to the next question. Explain the implication of the statement. Various advice offices of the Black Sash became crucial points of resistance for the black majority in the context of the challenging apartheid legislation. Right, we are seeing here black people resorting to Black Sash offices. And for the same reason, we are saying, what is the context of that statement in challenge of apartheid? So we can safely say black people the black people relied on the Black Sash offices for support to fight against apartheid. Remember, the Black Sash offices, they were there to give legal advice to black people, either those who wanted legal advice on how to get their imprisoned people out of prison, or those who had people in detention, they wanted to get advice on how to get their loved ones who were in detention out of detention. So black people were now heavily relying on the Black Sash offices for support to fight against apartheid. Or we can also say it was a much safer way for Africans to challenge apartheid. We know well that the government was imposing restrictive measures by banning people, by those different measures like detention without trial. So it was safer for black people to challenge apartheid through Black Sash offices. It was a much safer way to challenge apartheid, unlike challenging using the traditional methods of protest and of introducing some other measures. Or we can also say, for the sake of the black people, it was an effective way to challenge apartheid through Black Sash. For that reason, black people, they ended up flocking the Black Sash offices so that they could ultimately um, find ways of challenging apartheid. Or we can simply say the Black Sash assisted blacks in their fight against oppression. Right, that was question number 115. We move on to the next source. Our next source is a source which is in the context of source 1b. Or source 1B, it's a photograph appeared in the Observation Post South Africa Military History publication on 3 October 2015. It depicts members of the Black Sash in support of the mass democratic movement. Defiance campaign, which anti-apartheid placards with anti-apartheid placards in Cape Town, August 1989. Right, so that's the picture. That's what you are seeing. And also we are seeing what is indicated on those placards. One person, one vote, abolish apartheid legislation, let's learn from history, free the press to tell the truth, all those demands. And on top, the banner is saying defiance is the right to peaceful protest. Right, let's go to our questions. Our first question is saying, comment on the importance of the words on the banner. Why are those words important? Defiance is the right to peaceful protest in the context of Black Sash strategies to resist. So if they're saying defiance is the right to peaceful protest, we are saying the Black Sash was encouraging people to use defiance. We know what defiance is. When we're talking of defiance, we are looking at disobedience. We are saying defiance is disobedience. We know there were segregatory laws that were put in place by the apartheid government. For example, the segregation of amenities. There were areas like the beach areas, which were meant for the whites and which were meant for the Africans, for Europeans and non-Europeans. There were train sections, which were meant for the Europeans and also the non-Europeans. When people were defying, they were disobeying those laws. They were disobeying those regulations voluntarily, not out of lack of knowledge, but willingly and knowingly. So they were encouraging people to defy as a way of showing their discontent to the practices of apartheid, which were unfair. Or we can also say there are Black Sash advocated for peaceful protests. They did not want to engage in violent protests. They wanted people to engage in peaceful protests. That is why they are having that banner with that written information. Or we can say the Black Sash did not want the government to impose restrictions on them. We know well that the government was imposing restrictions whenever there was violence, or they would put some other repressive measures like state of emergencies so that they would try to contain the situation. So the Black Sash was adopting an approach which was not too extreme, which was not an extremist approach, so that the government would not impose those strict measures and also would not ban some of its members. Or we can say they were avoiding violence, because we know well that the government was usually violent in situations whereby people protested violently or illegally. So it was also avoiding the incidents of violence against state security agents. Right, we'll move on to the next question. Next question is saying, using the information in the source and your own knowledge, explain why the Black Sash displayed a placard that read, "One person, one vote." One person, one vote. The implication of that statement is each individual's vote must be treated as an individual vote. There must be no person whose vote is counted double or otherwise, because one individual's decision must be one decision, We cannot have one person having 3 decisions at the same time. One individual, one vote. So they were ultimately advocating for a fair voting system. They wanted a fair voting system or electoral process. They were advocating for a fair voting system. Or we can also say they were advocating for fair representation. On the votes from different racial groups. They were advocating for a fair representation of votes on votes from different racial groups because the system was unfair in such a way that a white person's vote could be counted as a double vote. A colored person's vote would be counted as one. So it automatically meant that the whites were going to win whatever election they were voting in because of the process that was flawed, that was not fair. So they were advocating for a single person's vote must be regarded as a single vote. One person, one vote. Right. Then number 1.3, refer to sources 1A and 1B. Explain how the information in source 1A supports the evidence in source 1B regarding the strategies used by the Black Sash against apartheid. Right, what I just wanted to encourage you there is for you, when you are answering this question, can you please follow the format of comparing questions? Or when you're contrasting questions, can you please use the format which is prescribed? Do not use your other formats. You end up copying sources. You end up writing paragraphs where you are supposed to be getting one single idea. You compare to the next source idea and show how those two ideas are similar. So our format reads like this. Always remember, when you are comparing sources or contrasting sources, we are supposed to use this same format here. You say source 1A says whatever it says. And you have to rephrase that. You're not supposed to copy the source. Paraphrase the information, get only the idea in the source. Do not copy the source. Says whatever it says. And this is supported by source 1B, which, if it's a written, which says, or if it's a visual, which shows. You understand? This is a simple format. And make sure you present one idea here. Don't present 3 ideas. Don't bunch your ideas. Don't write too many things. Find one single idea. Source 1A says this. And this is supported by source 1B, which says this. Those two must be related. They must show similarities between those two sources. And you must present a single idea, and show how that single idea is portrayed in the other source. Not to copy sources and end up writing paragraphs. And remember, this is a 2-by-2 question. This is one bullet, which is going to give you 2 marks. You don't get 4 marks for this. You only get maximum 2 marks. Present another bullet in the same format again. Source, find a different idea now. Do not present the same idea that you have presented here. Find another different idea in the source. And use the same format. This is supported by source 1B, which says. Do not use, I understand you get to download memos and try to check responses. The memo is for the examiner, not for the learner. The examiner knows what they are supposed to do when they are marking. And you are not a marker, you are a learner. You are supposed to follow instructions. If you see a marking guide which says both sources, that is not for you. You must not use that format. Leave it to the memo. The memo is not yours. Right. So you must stick to this way of comparison of sources. You must stick to this format. That is the prescribed and the standard format of comparing sources and nothing else. Right. So you want to find ideas which are similar from the two sources and present them in the right source comparison format. Right. Like if we check, we go to our sources, try to find ideas and try to compare the ideas. This is a visual source and this is a written source. Right. If we try to check, for example, I will highlight maybe 2 or 3 examples of how you must compare those sources. Right. If you check here, the black sash, how was it made up of? It started over a cup of tea by 6 middle-class white women who were angered by the government attempt. So we are saying the idea here is the black sash was made up of white middle-class women. That is your idea. Pick that idea only. The black sash was made up of, source 1A says the black sash was made up of middle white class women. And this is supported by source 1B, which shows white women. This is a white woman. 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 So you see, that is how you compare. You get an idea there. You see how the same idea is presented in the other source. Black sash was made up of white women who were infuriated by the government's idea. And this is supported by source 1B, which shows white women. You go and try to identify another idea from the source. Right. If we look at our source, we see the names of the women, and we also see strategies employed by this silent sisterhood, included black sashing or wearing of a black sash. You see an idea there. Source 1B, 1A says the women were wearing black sashes, or they were using black sashing. And this is supported by source 1B, which shows the women with their black sashes. These are the black sashes that we are talking about. These ones. These ones. So you see how easy it is to compare sources. Besides that, you can still find other ideas from the source. It also talks about black resistance. It talks about the other information which is supportive of each other. It talks about newspaper harassment here. It says the black sash were also invaluable or helpful source of information for newspapers operating in difficult circumstances. Newspapers were operating in difficult circumstances. They were assisting the media, which was operating in difficult circumstances with harassment by the state. How is it supported? It is supported here. Free the press to tell the truth. You see, sources saying the newspapers were in trouble, they were being harassed by the government, and the same information is portrayed again here, where it says they were advocating for freeing of the press to tell the truth. If you check again, you can find information again on the vote. It's also there in the first source, and it's also portrayed here. So basically, that is how you compare the sources. I was just trying to highlight to you how easy it is to compare sources. So you must not face any challenge when you're comparing sources. Comparison of sources, just pick an idea and check the same idea in the next source and use the right prescribed format of comparing sources that I've given you here. Right, moving on to the next question. Source 1C. According to the source, how did white South Africans respond to their own regime being singled out from general condemnation? Right, this is according to the source. We are going to source 1C. We find the information there. We don't need to waste time. Right, it says White South Africans often feel aggrieved or upset that in this brutal and violent world, their own regime is being singled out amongst other tyrannies or oppressors. So they are feeling, the question is saying, how did they respond to their own regime being singled out? Their regime was being singled out as the only one. So they often felt aggrieved or upset. They were very angry that in this brutal world, why are you exposing us of doing brutal things against the blacks? Let it happen because it's a thing of the world. Why are you condemning us when there are other tyrannies or oppressors who are oppressing people across the world? Why are you trying to fight against the apartheid regime when everyone else is doing the same? They were justifying that oppression was a thing of the day. It was not supposed to be condemned at any cost. So they were angry. Right. Moving on to the next question. Identify two concerns raised in the source about the treatment of children by the apartheid regime. Two concerns raised in the source about the treatment of children by apartheid regime. Right. State of emergency is officially over, but children in many places continue to be specific targets of official persecution. Children were being tortured and they were being harassed. So those two, we are talking of persecution, which was in the form of torture and also harassment of children, despite the state of emergency being over. Right. Next question. Quote a phrase from the source indicating that how the author proposes to consider in to consider the near future and implications of the treatment of children. Right, we just got the source. We want to quote evidence. Right, it says here, furthermore, the damage inflicted by their experiences will remain with them and us for the rest of their lives. The damage that was inflicted on the children by their experiences of being tortured and the experiences of being harassed by the apartheid government, it was going to remain with them and also with the elders for the rest of their lives. Right. Number 114, explain what Mary Dyer means by the statement, our Western Christian society has surely lost its claim to being ordinarily civilized towards children. What is the implication? Our Western Christian. Right. It implies that the Western Christian was neglecting the basic rights of children. It was not protecting the basic rights of children. Or we can also say the treatment of children was unjustified. The treatment that was given to children was unjustified. And primitive. The way children were treated before their rights were realized is the same way the children were being treated in the modern world. So that is why it's saying being ordinarily lost its claim to being ordinarily civilized. We are in a civilized world. We must be adopting civilized ways of handling the rights of children and respecting the rights of children. But we are seeing the neglect of the rights of children in the same modern world which we are claiming to be civilized. So we are saying it was unjustified and it appeared to be primitive for that sense. Right. Moving on to the next question. Explain the term solitary. Um, sorry. We're moving on to source 1D. Right, source 1D, let's check the context of the source. Right, the context of the source, it says, source 1D is an extract below from a book published in 1991, the book titled Black Sash, The Beginning of a Bridge in South Africa by Case Pink, chronicled or reported women's human rights abuses for the Black Sash. It outlines how P.2 Botha's government reacted to the leaders of the Black Sash. Right, looking at this is an experience of the leaders of the Black Sash. And we want to go to our question. Our question is saying, according to the source, what was the Black Sash policy as an organization in relation to protests against apartheid government? Give one response. What was their policy against their resistance to apartheid? Right, it says the policy of the Black Sash as an organization, it was to uphold or maintain the rule of law with its absolute commitment to lawful and peaceful protests. That was its policy. It wanted to maintain the rule of law, and it wanted to have an absolute commitment to lawful and peaceful protests. It did not advocate for unlawful protests, or did not advocate for violent protests. It was only advocating for peaceful protests to maintain order and maintain the rule of law. Right. Moving on to the next question. Explain the term solitary confinement in the context of the policy advocated by the apartheid government in dealing with anti-apartheid protesters. Right, we want to try to get an idea from the source. Where do we find solitary confinement? Is here. Right, let's try to get the sense from the context of the source. On 12 June 1986, Annika van Klinswyk, chairperson of the Black Sash Pretoria branch, was arrested in her own home in the early hours of the morning. She was kept in solitary confinement in the Pretoria prison for several weeks and then taken to police cells where she was interrogated. The arrival of the security police in Janet Small's office took her completely by surprise. She was told to pack a bag and taken to prison for almost was taken to prison immediately because there was no other white women in detention. And because the prison authorities were very strict about racial segregation, she found herself in solitary confinement for 3 months. Again, we are seeing the same concept, solitary confinement. So we can get the idea there. When someone is being kept in solitary confinement, it means that they are being locked in isolation. Someone is being locked in isolation. So our solitary confinement here in ordinary understanding, we are saying solitary confinement rather, in simple terms, we are saying it's keeping someone in isolation. Or imprisoning a person alone. Or we can say being kept in individual cells. That's solitary confinement. You are alone and you are by yourself. You are locked up in a space which is confined. In a smaller space, you're looking at a cell situation here. You know the cells, like an individual cell. You are alone there. You are by yourself. You are separate from any other individual. You are in solitary confinement. Right, let's move on to the next question. Why do you think Janet Small was banned from speaking to journalists? Or writing for publication after being released from prison. Why did the government deny her a right to talk to journalists or deny her to make a publication? Right. For obvious reasons, it was that so that she could not expose the harsh conditions she was exposed to. If she was given a chance to talk to journalists, she was going to disclose whatever happened to her during her time of detention and during her time of imprisonment. So they did not want it to become a known thing about the conditions that she was exposed to during her time of detention and also how she was kept in solitary confinement. And also, as another way, it was also a way of weakening resistance. Remember, those were the key members of resistance. She was a chairperson in Pretoria, meaning to say, if she was given a chance to talk to the media and be given a chance to influence people to continue with the resistance, it was going to cause more commotion. So it was a way of weakening resistance by disallowing her public exposure. Right. We'll move on to the next question. Comment on the usefulness of the source to a historian researching the treatment of leaders of the Black Sash by P.2 Botha. Right, I want you to note here, when you're looking at usefulness, do not confuse usefulness with reliability. When you're looking at usefulness, we want tangible information. What tangible information are you going to are you getting from the source about the treatment of leaders by the government? That is what you want to check there. So if you check on the of source trying to figure out useful information, we can say it's useful because it tells us that the chairperson was arrested at her home. She was not in action. She was not protesting. She was ultimately at her home early in the morning. So it's useful information. It gives us how the apartheid government was operating. It gives us a view. If you're someone who is learning about the treatment, you can see apparently that the Black Sash women were the targets of the apartheid security forces. Someone is being arrested at their home. They are not even in action. They are not protesting, but they are being arrested. It's useful information. Or it also says they were interrogated. It's also useful information. They went through interrogation. What you call interrogation here? It's strong questioning. You get to be exposed to a panel of people questioning you, and you're supposed to give them satisfying responses, which is an act which disturbs the mind. You are being tormented by questions. And also you can check that the police, it also gives us information that the police detained the activists. And to be specific, they were detained in confinement, in solitary confinement. It's useful information to know how they were detained. They were detained and kept as individuals alone without interacting with anyone. So it's useful information on the treatment. And also, if you check, we also see that they were exposed to racial segregation. They did not want them to mix with other races. But the Black Sash was a liberal organization which was inclusive of all other races. They did not care who joined them in the fight against apartheid. They were even fighting for the black communities, for the media. But however, the security forces, they gave them strict segregation practices that they could not mix with any other people. This chairperson, since there were no other white women in the police cells, she had to be kept in solitary confinement on her own because they were practicing strict segregation. So if you check, that is useful information. So there's a difference between usefulness of a source and the reliability of a source. Reliability, you are saying, can we trust the source? Is this the truth? Can we safely conclude that we are getting correct information? That is reliability. Usefulness, we are saying, what information of substance are we getting from the source? Right. Going to number 1.6. Using the information in the relevant sources and your own knowledge, write a paragraph of about 8 lines explaining how effective the strategies of the Black Sash were in mobilizing against the apartheid regime. Right, I'll highlight on what we are supposed to do when you're answering a paragraph question. The ideas, you'll find them in the sources. Because remember, our paragraph is always supposed to be written in the PIL format. The same way you write your paragraphs in the essays should be the same way your paragraphs look for a paragraph question. The first part is we want a point or we want an answer or a line of argument. Here you must create your own independent line of argument according to your understanding. And your independent line of argument, you must be able to support it because it's yours. You must support it with explanations and evidence. Then you explain. Here when you are explaining, you are not copying sources. Explain in your own words. You are explaining your line of argument. Yeah. Or you're explaining your answer. Why are you answering the question in that direction? That is what you are explaining there. Maybe 2 statements explaining your answer. And you don't quote here. Whenever there is no quotation, we know that it's your own knowledge. You don't need to put own knowledge in brackets. You just write. We know that where there is no quotation, it's your own knowledge. Then when you give evidence, that is where you quote from sources. And when you are quoting, don't copy the sources. Just get the idea. This. The Black Sash was doing this. We are looking at supporting evidence on how effective they were. You indicate you got that in source 1A. You want to quote another piece of evidence. They did this. You are paraphrasing. You got that in source 1C. Do not use other funny quotations like it as it is in source 1A. Put the idea first, put the source in brackets at the end of the idea. Straight as that. Then provide a link. Otherwise, you are saying, how is what you said supporting your answer? Or how is it answering the question? That is a link. We're not saying repeat the link, repeat the opening statement. You are supposed to find ways of linking back to a line of argument. How is it answering the question? Whatever you were saying there, how is it related to the question? How is it answering the question? That is a link. So, like for example, I'll just give you a common example here of how you're supposed to answer this paragraph question correctly. Your line of argument must answer the question or your first opening statement. You must not start with explanations. You cannot start by explaining before answering a question. What are you explaining? You must respond to the question first. Then you give supporting information to your question. Again, were you in school yesterday? No, I was sick. Are you answering the question? There's no answer to the question there. Start by answering the question. Were you in school yesterday? No, I was not in school. Then you explain why you were not in school. Then you give supporting evidence that you were sick. Then you substantiate that you could not qualify to come to school because you were not fit enough to be in class. That is a paragraph. So we are saying here, you start by answering the question. What is the question saying? How effective? Explaining how effective. It's your own line of argument. The strategies, were they effective? If you are saying they were effective, then you must be able to support how effective they were. If you are saying they were ineffective, so your opening statement must address the question. So the Black Sash was very effective. Like, I want to use that as my line of argument. The strategies by Black Sash were very effective in challenging, in mobilizing against apartheid. Why are you saying they were very effective? You explain. The Black Sash did this. Whatever they did. You are supporting that it was effective, an effective way of challenging apartheid. In your own words. The other thing that you can do, if you don't have your own ideas, sometimes you did not study, you don't know what the Black Sash was doing. Go to the sources and get information from the sources about the effectiveness of the Black Sash and convert it in your own words. The moment you change the wording, it's no longer an extract from the source, because the same idea that you were supposed to think might be the same idea portrayed in the very same source. So we cannot deny you a right to think the same way a source has portrayed the information, but you rewrite it in your own words. You don't have to copy how it is in the source. And also when you're quoting, you paraphrase. And you explain, you give your evidence. Then at the end, you give a linking statement. Like, for example, the government realized that the Black Sash was becoming a threat through its peaceful protests and started being ruthless on the key figures of Black Sash. You are linking to the question. If it was not effective, the government wouldn't mind. They will ignore them. But the fact that the government was now taking strict measures, we're now arresting the key figures of the Black Sash, it shows that it was very effective in its ways of challenging apartheid. You cannot fight someone who is not competing with you. The fact that the government was now taking ruthless measures of arresting and keeping them in confinement, it actually shows or supports that the Black Sash was effective in challenging apartheid. Right. So that is how you answer the question. That brings us to the end of our first question. We are going to do question number 2 on the TRC. Why was the Mohapi family dissatisfied with the manner in which the TRC dealt with the death of Mapetla Mohapi in 1976? Right, we don't want to waste time. We want to answer the questions. Right, if we check, we are looking at the role of the TRC here in addressing the injustices that had taken place, that were done during the apartheid era. This is a post-apartheid institution which was meant to provide a peaceful transition from apartheid to a democratic South Africa. So we want to check on the first question. First question is saying, according to the source, in which village was Mapetla Mohapi born? Right, this is an extraction question. We don't want to waste time. We go to our source. Our source is here. The source below is from a book titled Coming to Terms, South Africa's Speech for Truth by Meredith. It highlights Mapetla's Mapetla Mohapi's political life until his death. Right, where was he born? Mapetla Frank Mohapi was born in a rural village of Tezanasuk in Stekspruit, which is the Transkei. So the village is this one. Right, moving on to the next question. Quote a reason from the source why Mohapi and other leaders of SASO and the Black People's Convention were detained in 1974. We want to quote a reason, which is an extraction question. Right, we just go to the source. What is it saying about their detention? Right, if we check here, it says, after students at several Black universities held pro-Frelimo rallies in October 1974 to celebrate the independence of Mozambique. That was when they were detained. Remember the Viva Frelimo rallies that were conducted in South Africa through the influence of Black consciousness. The Viva Frelimo rallies were uniting Black people and were giving Black people a hope that independence is on its way. After Mozambique became independent, South Africa was also feeling that independence is on its way to South Africa. So Black South Africans in South Africa were in support of the Mozambican movements and were celebrating the success of the attainment of independence in Mozambique from the Portuguese rule. So apparently, they were believing also that one day the apartheid government was also going to lose its grip on the Black South Africans and they will be united as an African region. Right. We'll move on to the next question. Right. 213. Question number 213 says, why do you think Mohapi was restricted to King Williamstown in September 1975? Why was he restricted in King Williamstown? Right. King Williamstown in the Eastern Cape. Our history that we know that the community projects were dominant in the Eastern Cape. And here it says Mohapi was banned under International Security Act and restricted to King Williamstown, where he was later employed as an administrator of the Zimele Trust Fund, established to assist released political prisoners. So we are saying why they restricted him, so that he could not have influence over the released political prisoners. Or we can also say to restrict his impact on the Black community projects, which were in King Williamstown. Remember, the Black community projects, most of them, they were there in the Eastern Cape, trying to uplift the standard of life of Black people. And these guys, being the influential guys from the university, they knew well that if they were going to be in those areas, they were going to uplift those community projects, and they were going to be very successful because they were sharp minds from university. So they didn't want them to get into contact with the community project so that maybe they might fail if they fail to find people who were intellectual, who were able to ultimately manage those projects and lead them to success. And also the influence of himself over the released political prisoners. Those projects, they were mainly meant to assist the ex-political prisoners to find a new way of life. So he was also, they were also restricting so that he doesn't have contact with those guys, and it was not going to influence them back into the struggle against apartheid. Right, and any other reason that you might think of. Right. What conclusion can be drawn from the fact that Mapetla died 20 days after he was detained in police custody? Let's check. Right, we are seeing here Moabi was banned. A month later, at the start of 1976 towards uprising, in a swoop of Black consciousness activities, Mapetla was again detained without a charge on 16 July. 20 days later, on 5 August 1976, Mohabi died in police custody. What is the implication there? The question is saying, what conclusion can be drawn? That he died 20 days after he was detained. So we can safely conclude his death in police detention. We knew well that that was an uncommon trend with the people who were detained. Most of them, they died in police custody. So there is evidence that there was police brutality. Apparently, he was exposed to brutality by the police, or he was tortured. until he died. Slowly tortured until he got to die in 20 days. That's the conclusion that we can draw. We can safely conclude that there was police brutality in the police cells. While he was detained, they exposed him to harsh conditions and to life-threatening conditions until he apparently died in the next 20 days. Or we can also talk of suspected poisoning, slow poisoning or suspected poisoning. We can also safely suspect that the police were using poisoning on political detainees. We know well that the apartheid government or the security forces were doing anything in their capacity to eliminate people who were opposing the rule of apartheid. Right. Moving on to the next question. Identify 3 reasons in the source why Ms. Mohapi attended the TRC human rights violations hearing on 15 April 1996. So moving on to the next source, we want to check on why Ms. Mohapi attended. Right. The widow to Mapetla Mohapi attended that particular TRC hearing. Right. Can you please tell us why you are here just before we start with your proceedings? Right. She is claiming that here, I have already mentioned I was never happy in the 20 years about the matter of Mapetla. But now, even now, I'm sure that he was never killed in any other way. After the TRC hearings, after the hearing about the TRC, I told myself I want to come and give evidence about how I felt. I want to tell the commission so that they can assist me in finding out what happened to him, because he never killed himself. So we are seeing our piece of evidence here of why she appeared. We are seeing that she was never happy in the last 20 years. That is why she had to go and present a case. Even now, she was not happy. She was not happy in the last 20 years, and even that particular day, she was not happy. And she wanted to come and give evidence about the hate that she felt. And she also wanted to tell the commission so that they can assist in her plea to identify and examine on what happened to the husband. Right, that is extraction question. The evidence is there. Let's go on to the next question. Define the term inquest. What is an inquest? At an inquest, we can say it's an inquiry. An inquiry. You are inquiring on something. You are trying to find information on something. Or you can say it's a formal investigation. Which is usually, it's a formal investigation. Usually in the cause, especially is done to prove the cause of a death. Into the cause of a death. We want to find out the real causes of a particular death. We do an inquiry, we do an investigation. We want to find deeper information and have a clearer understanding of what caused the death of a particular individual. We do an inquest. Right. Moving on to the next question, number 2.2.3. Comment on the implication of the statement. There was a policeman who confirmed that this man, Mohapi, would never take his life in the context of Mapetla Mohapi's death. Right, this man would never take his life. It's a police officer who is confirming that the way he knew Mohapi, he was very sure that that man would not kill himself. So what is the implication? The first implication is he was murdered by the police. If someone is testifying that this man, I know him, he will never kill himself, then what happened to him? It meant that he was murdered by the police. Or directly, We can also argue that there was foul play. The police were pretending as if they were not very sure of the cause of the death of Mohapi, but there was foul play that would have happened with the police while he was still in detention. They would have done some tricks on him and apparently took his life. And if you also try to check, we can also say he was murdered in the hands of the police, like what we have earlier on said. And like in the context of the last statement, the police officer is testifying that this man would never take his life. What kind of a person he was in the context of that statement. If someone is testifying that I know this guy, he will never do such an act. He can never take his own life. We are seeing him as an activist who was very active in fighting against oppressive measures of apartheid. So why would he take his life before he achieved the overall result of the liberation of South Africa? We can also take it in that dimension that he was someone who was dedicated to the liberation of South Africa. And there was no way he could terminate his life prematurely before he realized the liberty in South Africa, or before he realized the democratic South Africa that he was fighting for. You cannot fight for something for long, then along the way, you retire by taking your own life. That was not a justified claim that the police were giving. So based on that argument, we can safely conclude that because of his determination towards the liberation of South Africa, he was not a traitor or someone who was apparently fearful against the apartheid government. He had been detained for quite a number of times. Starting from university, he had faced the ruthless hand of the apartheid government, but he was still soldiering on, trying to fight against oppression. So why would he take his life in the hands of the police? There was no reason. Right. Then we check explain why Nontle Moapi was surprised at losing the case in the Supreme Court. Let's check in the source. Why was he surprised? Right. If we check here, it says in the Supreme Court, it was also said that nobody could be blamed about what happened. We were told that we have lost the case and we have to pay the cost. How would a court say nobody could be blamed about what happened? Someone disappeared, someone lost their life, and the highest court is saying no one can be blamed. Then why is it there if it cannot figure out who is to blame for such a serious crime? She had all the reasons to be surprised by this statement from the ruling of the court. Nobody could be blamed for what happened. Then who? Then the person just disappeared and we just have to let it go like that. It was unjustified. It was something which was very surprising on the side of someone who was asking for answers as to the disappearance of their very own husband. Then we are also seeing that after that, the court is claiming that they were supposed to pay the costs. We have lost a court case, and again, you are supposed to pay the costs. And if we check the nature of the costs, they were supposed to pay 250,000. What costs were incurred by the costs, which amounted to 250,000 in their investigation? A court sitting claiming the cost of 250,000. They were ultimately avoiding the claim against the disappearance and the death of Mohapi. That is why they were giving all those false claims that we could not find someone to blame. And also you are supposed to pay for the costs. They just wanted to discourage the family from pursuing the case. Right. That is question number 2.2.4. All right, moving on to the next question. They said, explain why a historian would regard this source as reliable when researching on how the TRC dealt with the Mohapi case. Right. I think I mentioned earlier on the difference between reliability and the usefulness of sources. When we are talking of reliability, are we saying this source is reliable? What we need to check for you to determine the reliability of a source, you need to check the nature of the source. Right. When you're analyzing sources, we tend to find that primary sources are more reliable. First-hand information is more reliable than secondary sources. Something that you eyewitnessed is we can safely rely on what you tell us over something that you witnessed physically. Unlike narrating a story that you were told by someone else who were attending a particular event and you being in absentia, we can misrepresent some facts, or you can miss some other facts, or you can be biased, or we can have some exaggerations. Right. So you check on the nature of the source. We are not saying all eyewitness sources are reliable, but they are more likely to be reliable compared to secondary sources. That's the idea when you are looking at the nature of the source. Right. Then you also check the time frame. A source which was produced in 2025 talking about apartheid in 1972, that source is most likely to be unreliable because of the time factor. If you are narrating a story that happened in the morning and it's in the evening, you still remember a lot of facts. Unlike narrating a story that happened in the last 35 years. So you check also on the time frame of the source and try to analyze if the time frame of the source is apparently in line with the time of the historical event. Then you also check, besides checking the time frame, you also check on the purpose of the source. Why was it created? Some sources are created for the sake of propaganda, to influence people to think in a given direction, to make people believe what they must, to make people believe something which is not realistic, something which is not true. So if you check if it's an informative source, it's more likely to be reliable because there is no propaganda there. You are not creating a source to influence people to think in a given direction. Then you can also check on emotive language. Right. What you call emotive language, if a person is using emotions, then are they likely to be telling us the truth? Because they are not reasoning. They are using emotions. If a source has got emotive language, be mindful that source is most likely to be unreliable. Like those sources mostly in paper one, when you are looking at the origins of Cold War, how the communists label the capitalists. They label them as fascists, or they label them as dictators. And yet, if we look into the realistic of the nature of capitalism versus communism, which one is more fascist than the other? We see that communism is more fascist, but they label capitalism as fascist elements. That is emotive language. Or if you find someone labeling someone using some very strong language, that is less likely to be reliable. Then also you can check on bias. A source which has got bias, which is one-sided, is less likely to be reliable. So let's analyze this source and try to figure out evidence of reliability from this source. Right, if we check here, I want to try and figure out if this source is reliable. Our answer, we are saying the source is reliable, but we want to substantiate the evidence from the source. Right, I always tell learners to check on the context of the source before they answer the questions, because the context of the source usually assists you in answering questions on reliability, questions on limitation, questions on bias, questions on usefulness of sources. So don't start answering a source before looking at the context of the source. What is the source about? Who created it? Why was it created? Then you can also use that information to answer on those questions. Right. Is reliable this source? Because it's from TRC hearings. We know that the TRC was instituted by the government of South Africa after independence. And we know that the TRC came into play under the directorship of Desmond Tutu and Alan Borain. That is non-information. So if this is an extract from an event which is known in the history of South Africa, then it's reliable. And also, if we check the time frame, it was held on 15 April 1996. The TRC was elected soon after independence in 1994, and it did its work until around 1998. So if we check, this is an extract which was ultimately created on the 15th of April 1996. So it's also reliable because of the time factor. The time frame of the source is lying within the time frame of the operation of the TRC and the investigative hearings of the TRC. And also, if we check the person who is portrayed here, if you remember the Black consciousness, Mapetla Mohapi was one of the people who were influential in influencing university students in the at University of Teflop, which is now Limpopo, amongst some of the members of the Black consciousness like Steve Biko and those other guys. So this is a well-known figure in the history of South Africa. And if we are hearing a testimony and we are hearing a human rights violation committee holding a case involving a prominent figure in the history of South Africa, then we can safely rely because of the figures who are being investigated in this extract of our source. Right. That is how you must answer a source on reliability, but we are not limiting it to that. There are other aspects that you can also look at to justify that a source is reliable. And do not usually change the question. Like if a question says, comment on the usefulness of a source, then you say the source is not useful. Usually you fail to find information to support because already there is a question on limitation of sources. If the examiner knows that the source is limited, they will ask you directly that comment on the limitation of this source because limitation is the opposite of usefulness. If a source is limited, it means it's giving us less information and it does not teach us anything. Then if a question is saying usefulness, then it means that source has got a tangible information, tangible historical facts that you can use and help you understand a specific historical aspect. Right. Then we need to analyze also the next question. The next question is based on source 2C. Source 2C is a photograph which was taken of it's a family photograph at the police station. These guys wanted to actually do an investigation in the cell where Mohapi was claimed to have committed suicide, but apparently they were denied access into the police cell. That's the source that we have as source 2C. Right, so let's check the questions. Why might the Mohapi family want to visit the cell in which Mapeta died? What might be the motive of them visiting the police station and trying to get access to the cell? Right, we can argue over that question why the family chose to go to the police station and try to find out about the death of their loved one. Right, our argument, we can argue that they wanted to ascertain if there was any evidence there in this in the police cell. So we can say they wanted to ascertain or validate if there was any evidence. We know that where a person can commit suicide, you can justify that it's possible for a person to commit suicide in a given situation. But in some situations, it's not possible. So they wanted to actually get proof, or they wanted to validate the statement because they were not sure and they were still unsure of the claims that were made by the police. So they wanted actually to prove for themselves if it was possible that a person would commit suicide in that police cell. That might be a reason why they wanted to go there and try to check on themselves. And also to get closure on the loss of their loved one. We know as Africans, we visit places of accidents to get closure on the loss of our loved ones. So they wanted actually to visit the exact place where their loved one lost his life. It was going to assist them to get closure in regard to the loss of Moapi. But however, the police denied them access to the police cell. And we might also argue that they might have wanted to perform either some religious or cultural rituals. The African society has got a variety of beliefs, and those beliefs cannot be separated from the people who are before in those beliefs. So, as Africans, there is also a tendency of performing rituals over the loss of loved ones. So, we might also claim that maybe their intention was to go to the cell and perform some either cultural or religious rituals to ultimately mark the loss of their loved one. Right. That was question number 2.3.1. Moving on to 2.3.2, using the information in the source and your own knowledge. Explain why this photograph appeared in the Amandla newspaper 41 years after Mapetla's death. Right, this photograph is appearing 41 years later after the incident has happened. Why did it appear so late? For an obvious reason, the apartheid government wanted to conceal evidence. They wanted to hide evidence. Remember, they denied the family access. So they did not want the public to know that they denied access to the police cell to the family of the person whom apparently they had murdered. So they wanted to conceal evidence. And also, we might say why it appeared 41 years later after the death. We can attribute it to the apartheid government was fearing international exposure and criticism. They were apparently going to be exposed to the outside world and also be criticized for being ruthless and for taking political activists' lives. And we can also argue in that direction, um, it was because of press censorship. Remember, we talked about the Black Sash fighting for the rights of the media. The apartheid government would not allow anyone to publish anything at their own will. So, because of the effect of press censorship, it means by chance they could not allow for the publication of that particular photo. That is why it had to be published some 41 years later after independence, because of the effect of censorship of the media. And also, we can say, in the sense of Black people, we can say it was published to remember or to honor the fallen hero. He played a crucial role in the politics of South Africa, and he is worth to be remembered. Right. Those are some of the responses, but we're not limiting to those ones. You can think in other dimensions and come out with other valid responses answering the question. Right. We move on to our last source, which is source 2D. Right. Our source 2D. Let's check the context of our source and check on the questions. Right. Source 2D is an extract from a review by Klina, an investigative journalist, of the book titled Now You Know How Mapetla Died, The Story of Black Consciousness Matter. Right. It criticized the TRC for not doing justice to Mohapi's case and government for not doing anything to pursue the case further. That's the context of the source. Right. So the first part is saying, quote 4 pieces of evidence from the source indicating why Valela had some harsh words for the TRC. Right. Why is Valela having some harsh words? Right, we want to check, it's an extraction question. We just check the evidence in the source. Right, the context of Valela here, if we check what she was, why she was shouting, right, she's saying, starting from sentence number 2, Valela has some harsh words for its modus operandi, the way of operation, that echoes the Azanian People's Organization standpoint. And some may find it unreasonable. Where she, Valela, is on firm ground, however, is to question exactly how the TRC has served justice in Mohapi's case. And then it says, no one came forward to seek amnesty. And the government did nothing to pursue the non-suspects. Right, in this case, she was very furious in the sense that these people were known. These culprits, these former security police officers, they were known. And they did not come to seek amnesty. The TRC was calling for people to come and seek amnesty so that they can be forgiven for the crimes that they committed. And for a particular reason, maybe they knew that their crimes were not politically motivated, or they were out of proportion, or they were not going to fully disclose the truth. They could not go before the commission. And for that sake, it was angering her that a person who has committed a crime, the government is giving you a chance to come before the TRC and seek for forgiveness, and they're not coming. And what did the government do? The government also did nothing to pursue the non-suspects. The government knew well who did the assassination of Mapetla, and apparently they did not follow on the suspects. And it also says here, not only is accountability unfulfilled, but the original inquest verdict is still part of the judicial record. The records were still there. Remember, the Supreme Court, the case was presented before the Supreme Court, and the records were still there. But they did not make any follow-up. So she was very disappointed to the fact that she has lost someone and she's expecting the government to deliver justice. And the government has got the records and they are keeping on the records. They are not even making a follow-up to check on the people who committed the crimes. And the last one, it says, the historical truth remains incomplete. There was no full disclosure as to the death of Mohapi. He died, but there was no full disclosure. The Supreme Court says you cannot blame anyone for that particular case. And then what does that mean? If a government is neglecting the needs of its very own people, which it's supposed to serve, then it means that is an incompetent government in that direction. Right. So those are the 4 pieces of evidence. We check on the next question. Right. The next question is saying, identify 2 reasons in the source why some inquests have been successfully reopened. Right, some inquests which were made, some investigations, and some inquiries which were presented in the past. Why did the government make a follow-up? It was for 2 reasons for the government to make a follow-up. Right, where inquests have been successfully reopened, it has been due to private initiatives and resources, which implied that for people to have their cases being reopened, they were supposed to take a private initiative. They were supposed to put their own private effort, not to wait on the state effort. The state was just seated and watching over. They were not taking any initiative to reopen those cases and to make further investigations on those cases. And the other problem was that of resources. You were supposed to have resources. Remember, this family was tasked by the Supreme Court to bring 250,000 for the cost of the court. Which court on earth will charge costs which amount to 250,000 for an investigation of a person who was murdered by the state security agencies? So it meant that for a person's case to be pursued further, you were supposed to have money. If you didn't have money, then they would just close the case and ignore it. Right. Those are the 2 reasons. Then moving on to the next question. Right. It is saying, explain the term post-apartheid owner in the context of people who fought against apartheid. Post-apartheid honor, we define it in simple terms. We can say it's the recognition, or we can say it's the respect. Granted to political anti-apartheid activists. After independence. Right, the government was supposed to honor people who participated in the fight against apartheid. It was not an easy struggle. Remember, the struggle began as early as the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910. And it was a continued struggle until the apartheid government came into play in 1948. And when it instituted segregatory practices, which became an official policy of apartheid, things became very difficult for the black men. There were several things that were implemented by the government. There were several laws and regulations and measures that were meant to segregate black people from the white community. And because of the policy of separate development, people were exposed to extreme economic disadvantages. Not only economic disadvantage, but in all aspects of life. Political, social, economic, black people were marginalized. And for that sake, there were people who opted to sacrifice their own personal selves to fight against that. Remember, because of we're talking about the self-consciousness of the black people, which was supposed to be reinstalled through black consciousness. People were having a sense of self-pity. Most of the black people had accepted that we cannot fight against the white man. Let's leave him. Let's leave him do what he wants, and let's let him decide for us until maybe we don't know. But there are people who sacrificed to fight against such oppression and to fight against those injustices of apartheid. Those people were supposed to be honored post-independence. After independence, they were supposed to be recognized. Their works were supposed to be honored after the government attained independence in 1994. So that is basically what we refer to as the post-apartheid honor in the context of the people who fought for apartheid. They actually did a very great job, which is supposed to be honored for the entire life of South Africa. For it was not their effort, then South Africa would have been still by now in apartheid state. Right. We go to number 2.44. Using the information in the source and your own knowledge, comments on what the source referred to as a shameful state of affairs regarding Mohapi's death. A shameful state of affairs. Let's check in the source where we find the statement. Right. It says, our source is saying, Mohapi was awarded a post-apartheid honor, but so far has been denied the dignity of re-examination of the circumstances of his death. This can be ascribed or explained by the general state of corrupt inertia or inaction in the government. Perhaps this book will alter a shameful state of affairs. So we are looking at a shameful state of affairs here. What does it imply? What it implies directly, it implies that the government was incompetent in solving that issue. The government was ineffective in dealing with that case. Was failing to handle cases properly. The judicial system, if we check, the Supreme Court is denying and is also saying we can't find a blame. Then are we supposed to find the blame? And who is supposed to handle such cases? It is the duty of the legislation to handle such cases, but the government is folding its hands, looking into such a grave situation. So the government was ultimately failing to handle cases properly. That is why it was in a shameful state of affairs. And also we can say, in other dimensions, the TRC was ineffective in delivering its intended service. It's failing to handle cases properly. It is mandated to solve those cases and to deal with those cases, to investigate human rights violations, to assess and find who is worth to be granted amnesty, and also to rehabilitate victims of circumstances of apartheid injustices. But it's not performing effectively. Then we are in a shameful state. We are instituting committees to investigate cases, but the committees are failing to deliver what they are supposed to deliver. So we are in a shameful state of affairs. Or we can also argue that the government failed to deliver, or incompetence of the government through the TRC. We are in a shameful state because we are having an incompetent government. The people are commenting that the government is in a general state of corrupt inertia. It's in inaction. So it means the government is proving to be incompetent in dealing with investigations. They know well that people were murdered, but they're not taking any action to follow up on the perpetrators of the gross human rights violations. Right, so that can be an argument. Right, then moving on to the next question. We want to look at the next question as question number 2.5. Refer to sources 2b and 2d. Explain how the information in source 2d supports the evidence in source 2b regarding the challenges faced by the family in pursuing Mapetla Moapi's case. We want to check on the similarities of source 2b and source 2d in regard to the challenges that were faced by the family in dealing, pursuing this particular case of the loss of Moapi. Right. Like what I mentioned earlier on, do not complicate things. You just find a simple idea and you check the same idea in the other source. So we are dealing with source 2b and source 2d. Source 2d is this source that we have just been using, which is showing a critique of the TRC in handling the case of Mapetla. And source 2b, we want to go back and check on the context of the source and quickly find information which is presented in the same dimension. Right, this one is an extract of a TRC hearing on the Human Rights Violations Committee. So we want to check for similarities. Right, if we check here, we are seeing that one fact that we can get from source 2b is that the case was brought before the Supreme Court 20 years back. If we check here, the case was brought before the Supreme Court in 1979. Right, how is it portrayed in a given, in the same dimension in source 2D? If you come to source 2D here, it is saying some inquests have been successfully reopened. So we see this case has been presented before the courts and was not properly handled. And it is supported that the very same cases were reopened when the TRC was put into action. So they are supporting each other. They are giving us the same information that previously cases were put in the judicial system and some of them were not handled properly and we have to be closed. But because of the TRC, now those cases have to be reopened. And also if you check, it says in source 2C, source 2C is saying nobody could be blamed about what happened. It's Ms. Moapi who is testifying what the Supreme Court said. In the Supreme Court, it was also said that nobody could be blamed about what happened. So the Supreme Court is denying responsibility. And how is it similar in source 2D? Source 2D is saying Moapi was awarded post-apartheid honor, but so far he has been denied dignity of re-examination of the circumstances of his death. The Supreme Court is denying to do a cross-examination and re-examine the case. It's supported here that he was denied dignity. If a court is saying no one can be blamed, then it means it's saying it's your own case to handle. So the two are supporting each other. Denying him re-examination is also supported by the court, which is saying no one can be blamed. And also, if we check to the side of Miss Moapi, what did she say? She was not sure about his husband's death. About her husband's death, she's saying here, even now, I'm sure that he was never killed in any other way. She's saying she was not happy for the past 20 years, and still even up to the day, she was not even happy. And she never knew how he was killed. This is supported by here. Why are they requesting for a re-examination? They want to find out the exact cause or the exact circumstances of the death of Petla. So that is basically how you compare sources. And remember to use the correct format. Our format, as I indicated in the previous questions, you use that very same format of source 2A says whatever. You get an idea. Do not bunch your ideas. Pick one idea only. And this is supported by the next source, which says this. The problem that most learners get here, which will make you lose marks, is not to pay attention to mark allocation. This answer is only 2 marks. Some of you will think that you get 4 marks because you have compared an idea from one source and the other source. It's 2 marks. You have to find another comparison idea, which is independent of the first one. If you repeat the first one using different rephrasing of the statements, then you are repeating the same thing. That is only 2 marks. Right. Then the next question. Next question is using information. Yes. In the relevant sources and your own knowledge, write a paragraph of about 8 lines, which is 8 words, explaining why Moab family was dissatisfied in the manner in which the TRC dealt with the death of Mapetla Moab in 1976. Right, it's a paragraph question. Remember, your paragraph question, you still answer it in the same format. You write your paragraphs in the essay. You must adopt the PIL format. And for that matter, you must start with an independent answer to the question. What is the question saying? Your question is saying, explaining, what must you explain? Why the Mohapi family was dissatisfied in the manner. So in your opening statement or in your answer, you must address the fact that the family was dissatisfied. And you explain why were they dissatisfied. You can explain this in the context of the working of the TRC. We know the TRC had got 3 committees. It had a committee on gross human rights violations investigations, and it had a committee on amnesty, and also it had a committee on rehabilitation. So based on these 3 committees, you must be able to execute what those committees were supposed to do in regard to the handling of Mohapi's case. If there's a committee which did not perform its function properly, then there was justification that the family was supposed to be dissatisfied to the working of the TRC because they could not execute their duties properly. So you can start your paragraph like, the family was strongly dissatisfied because the TRC handled the matter in an unprofessional way. The TRC handled the matter in an unprofessional. way. Then you explain why you are saying they handled it in an unprofessional way. What did they do that make you believe that the TRC was unprofessional? Or the family was not happy because justice did not prevail? It's an independent answer. You are not copying sources. You are not referring to sources here. Or the family was not happy because the case was not properly followed on. You see, this is an independent response. The family was dissatisfied in the manner because the TRC handled the case in a professional way. They did not uphold professionalism when dealing with the case of the murder of Mhapi. Or they did not do justice. Justice did not prevail. Or they did not properly make a follow-up on the case. That is your answer to the question. Then you explain what they did and what they were supposed to have done. And now you go to your sources, you pick your piece of evidence, and you support your line of argument with pieces of evidence from the sources. And having done that, it would have taken you to a linking statement to support and show that the family was dissatisfied. You can find a linking statement by referring to what the family did, like how the wife was complaining. Or you can link by showing how that other women had harsh words on the TRC and its workings. You provide a linking statement to support and show that the family was not happy or was dissatisfied with the way the case was handled. Right, that brings us to the end of question number 2. And then for the essay question, we're going to look at the crisis of apartheid, which is civil resistance, right, which is the black consciousness. Right, I'll take you through the essay. I'll just guide you on what you must do. I understand in most instances, the learners will be having the information at their disposal. They will be having all the points, and the problem now that they will have is creating paragraphs which conform to the PIL format using the ideas that they already have. There's a very serious challenge with the creation of paragraphs when you're writing your essays. Learners fail to find supporting evidence, or they lack information on the point. You cannot write a paragraph by infusing points or infusing different points in the same paragraph. That paragraph won't be contextualized or won't conform to the PIL format, because a paragraph must only be having one point and must be having one clear point answering the question. If you see yourself infusing 3 points in the same paragraph, your presentation is going to be poor, because now we are only listing. You are now going to a level of largely descriptive in your presentation. You're just describing things. There's no synthesis of information. You are not contextualizing your paragraphs to the given question. Right, let's look at our question. Then we'll look at those skills. Question number 4 said, civil resistance 1970 to 1980, South Africa, the crisis of apartheid in the 1980s. Right, political liberation of black South Africans was the only focus of the black consciousness. Political liberation of black South Africans was the only focus of the black consciousness. Critically discuss this statement with reference to the philosophy and actions of the black consciousness movement during the late 1960s and 1970s. Support your line of argument with relevant historical evidence. That is our question. Right. I think I have to highlight briefly on what you must do for you to be able to attempt and answer the question correctly. Otherwise, a critical discussion question, most of the learners, they lose marks because there won't be any critique there in their presentation. At what extent question is not presented the same as a critical discussion. A critique, you have to provide a two-sided argument. And in those two sides, one must be having more weight than the other, as you portray when you start your presentation or when you write your introduction. Right, let me start it this way. Our three set of questions, we don't want to waste time there. We have one, do you agree? It's one set of question. Then number two is to what extent? Then number three is critically discuss. So what you must do here, you must not waste time. When you are writing your introduction, these are the three set of questions that you are going to have. In your introduction, you must have three steps. The steps of an introduction. Number one is an answer or your line of argument. Right. If you don't have a line of argument or if you don't have an answer, then what are you doing? You are going to be descriptive in your presentation because you don't have an answer to the question. You must always be supporting your answer to the question. And if you don't have it, what are you going to support? How are you going to formulate your line of argument if you don't have an answer in the question? So if a person says, do you agree? Show by agreeing or disagreeing. This is your answer. Before you explain anything, show that you are agreeing or you are disagreeing to the fact. That is your answer to the question. If a question is saying to what extent, show the extent. Is it a larger extent or to some extent or to a limited extent? A greater extent or a lesser extent? You have answered the question. Show the extent before you explain anything. To a greater extent, what? To a lesser extent, this. That's an answer to the question. And if it's a critical discussion, we want a two-sided approval approach here. You approve the statement or you disapprove the statement. Approval, we are saying you are proving that the statement is historically correct based on historical evidence that you have. But however, what's the other side of the story? Because it's a critical discussion. Right. That is number one, what you want. Then number two, after you've answered the question, you must give reasons. Why are you saying you are agreeing to the fact that Black consciousness was a tool which assisted Black people to challenge apartheid? What did it do? You highlight general reasons. It is through Black consciousness that Black people got to realize their self-worth. Black people were assisted through community projects which were introduced through Black consciousness. Black people were able to have unity amongst themselves and fight against the common oppressor through the infusion of Black consciousness into their minds. You have given general reasons. We are not saying explain here. You are highlighting reasons that you are going to explain in your presentation. And number three, you must give an elaboration. The examiner wants to know the historical evidence that you are going to use. What are you going to say? What are you going to prove? So that we know the direction of the essay before we waste time. So that we can give you what you deserve before we waste time looking into your essay. This essay is going to shed more light on the influence of Black consciousness towards the liberation of Black people. It's an elaboration. The essay is going to shed more light on how Black consciousness assisted Black people to be economically independent. You are giving an elaboration or you are giving a highlight of what you're going to present. You are giving an orientation to the reader. Those are the three requirements of an introduction. If they are not there, that is where you see this sign in your introduction. It means aspects not contextualized. There is no answer to the question. You are just explaining something which is related to the question, but which is not answering the question. The purpose of getting into the examination is to answer the questions and get marks. That's all. If you know so much and you start explaining what you are not asked, can you please be an examiner and set your own exam? Get into the exam, answer the questions, and respond appropriately using the prescribed ways of writing. And up to now, I don't think there's anyone who doesn't know that we don't put subheadings when we are writing our history essays. We do not highlight. We do not put bullets. It's continuous writing. From your introduction until you get to your conclusion, there should never be a highlighter which you would apply. There must never be an underlining that you do. There must never be a bullet that you are going to put. There must not be any subheading. That is how you write your essays in history. If you put subheadings in other subjects, yes, it's fine. It's subject specific. In history, there's nothing like that. You write continuously. We know that the first part of your essay is your introduction because of what is contained there. And obviously, there is no essay which starts with the body. We know the first paragraph must be the introduction. And we check what is there in the introduction because we know there must be 3 steps: an answer to the question, and a reason or some reasons, and an elaboration. That's the 3 requirements of the introduction. Then the other thing that I must remind you of, when you're writing your essays, sometimes you include background information, but it's not very advisable to concentrate on the background information because you must answer the question. The background information will only assist someone who doesn't have the answers to the question for them to be able to understand the question and for them to be able to understand why things unfolded in that direction. We want history of events for us to be able to understand why events unfolded in that direction. It is because of the history. But is the history telling us about our current affairs? It's not answering our current affairs. It's just giving us the background of where we came from, which made us become who we are today. So do not focus on the background information. You don't get marks for that. You can just write 1 paragraph of background information, but be mindful not to waste time focusing on the background information because there are no marks for such. You must go straight to the answer to the question. So we are saying in this instance, our question is a critical discussion. What you're supposed to do is to approve the statement or disapprove the statement. The question is saying political liberation of Black South Africans was the only focus of the Black consciousness movement. We are saying Black consciousness was only targeting to liberate Black people politically. Is that correct based on the historical evidence that we have? We cannot approve that statement because we know it was not only political liberation. Political liberation was necessary, yes, because of the political suppression which was brought by apartheid and the apparent banning of political parties which was brought by apartheid, and also the banning of individuals, and also the resultant exile of many political activists, and some of them are being imprisoned. There was need for political liberation, yes. But we cannot also ignore political economic liberation. Black people were exposed to marginalization because of the policy of separate development. It was supposed to be addressed. There was also need for social liberation. Black people were now having a sense of pity for being black. Black people were now losing their cultural identity. They were now trying to copy the Afrikaner culture because they were feeling like it was inferior. Black people were also losing their identity as a community. They were now shunning being black because of the ideology of apartheid, which was dominating in their minds. So social liberation was also, economic liberation was also needed, and psychological liberation was also needed. Black people were supposed to change their mindsets. Some of them had accepted defeat from the apartheid authorities. They were supposed to change their way of life. They were supposed to change their way of thinking. So it's not only political liberation that was targeted by Black consciousness. So we have to give a view of political liberation, and we also give another view of other dimensions of liberation which were supposed to be incorporated in the ideology of Black consciousness movement. We know Black consciousness was a philosophy. It was supposed to be adopted as a way of life. A way of life starts with a right mentality. For you to be a good person, you must be having a clear and sharp mind, which meant that Black consciousness was supposed to change the mindset of the Black people first before liberating them politically and economically and socially and all those dimensions. They were supposed to adopt the philosophy and take it as their new way of life. So in this perspective, your answer must cater for political liberation and also must also cater for other dimensions of liberation. So you must disapprove this statement and give the broader perspective of dimensions of a liberation that were required. So you can start by saying Black consciousness. Black consciousness did not only focus on political liberation. As a way of whatever you explain that. You are showing that you are disapproving. This is an answer to the question. Your answer to the question, you are disapproving the statement Black consciousness did not only focus on political liberation. What else did it focus on? It was a broad concept. Incorporating psychological liberation. You are talking of the liberation of the mind, economic liberation. You are looking at community projects. You talk of social liberation, bringing in unity among the Black society. And also remember, it was not black for Black African. It was Black inclusive of colors and Indians. So there was supposed to be unity. We needed social liberation because we were meant to split according to racial groups. And there was no more unity. So there was no united society in the South African society because of the influence of apartheid practices. Then you are looking at the other dimensions of the question to show that there's a disapproval, but there is another side or another dimension to that particular perspective. Then you give your reasons. When you are giving reasons for critical discussion, you give dual reasons. You give reasons on the side of political liberation, which you have disapproved, and you also give reasons on the side of other dimensions of liberation. You cannot exhaust everything. You are just highlighting general reasons. Right. On political liberation, you are just giving reasons. Why was it needed? Or how did it implement a political liberation? Black consciousness influenced Black political parties. To fight for their existence and their rights. Remember, most of them were banned after the Sharpeville massacre. You are giving a reason on the political liberation. Then you also give reasons on the side of other dimensions of liberation. Maybe you are giving on economic. It is through Black consciousness that Black people had to undertake community, Black community projects. We know these community projects, they were meant to make Black people self-sustaining. So for the fact that Black people were now engaging in community projects to self-sustain, that was an economic liberation. They were no longer reliant on the apartheid government and now relying on themselves. They were now trying to devise their own economic sustenance, their own way of sustaining economically without relying on the government, to show the government that they can also do their own things without the assistance of it. You are seeing the dimension now. We are giving a two-dimensional, you are addressing your reasons to address the two extreme ends because it's a critical discussion. Then from there, you give your elaboration. This essay or this presentation is going to further shed more light on the dimensions of liberation that were brought to the African community, South African community, by Black consciousness. Your introduction has got the 3 steps and is complete. Then, given that, we now go to the ideas that you are supposed to use. The only problem that you're going to have here is a problem of people who misrepresent facts, a problem of people who have limited information, not because they don't know, but because they think they know. So that because they think they know, they don't study and they don't try to grasp the information at grassroots. They just check on the information and assume that they know. You don't know anything until you are able to present it, or you don't know anything until you are able to write it down. If you see information in the book, it's not in your mind. It will remain in that book. So the problem here is when we want to start with the background, you must start with the political vacuum. That is the background of Black consciousness. And most of you, you confuse the political vacuum. The political vacuum that we talk about here, we were saying, most of you, you say, based on the previous experiences, learners, they say the political vacuum was created because of the apartheid government hoping to suppress Black people. Like, there is no evidence there. You don't know what a political vacuum is. The political vacuum that is talked about when you want to include background information, don't talk of something which is irrelevant and which is wrong. We are saying in South Africa, there was limited resistance. That is a political vacuum. When the ANC was still active, they were mobilizing people to fight against the government. When the PAC was active, they were also mobilizing people to fight against the government. But what happened? The political parties were banned and were declared illegal. They were banned after the Sharpeville massacre. That was the key turning point of South African politics. The Sharpeville massacre resulted in the government declaring a state of emergency and banning political parties and declaring them illegal. Some activists were jailed. They were imprisoned. Some were detained without trial. Some even got banned. They were not supposed to address in public gathering. Some of were even in house arrest. They were not supposed to go anywhere without reporting to the police. And some, the majority of them, went into exile. The majority were in Zambia, some were in Mozambique, some were in Zimbabwe. They could not actively participate in the politics of South Africa because they were fearing for themselves. So if you are seeing this situation here, we are automatically seeing that the apartheid government had already won the situation. It had managed to suppress completely resistance amongst the Black communities because the people who were influential, talk of the people, the political figures like Oliver Tambo, talk of Nelson Mandela, talk of Robert Sobukwe, most of them were imprisoned. And they were the key figures who were supposed to motivate people to resist against the government. Them being in prison, it also meant that the morale of the general public got very low. People were no longer resisting because of the effect of the detention and the imprisonment of their key figures. We are motivated because we follow a leader. If the leader is imprisoned, that will apparently demotivate the public and also instill fear amongst the general public. So because of this situation, this is what we call a political vacuum. There was limited resistance to apartheid, and the apartheid government had apparently managed to control the situation completely. They had managed to suppress resistance because of the banning of political parties and because of the imprisonment of activists, because of the detainment of the activists, and also because of the activists going into exile. So that is what we call the political vacuum. Then what was the way forward? Did it mean that Black people were supposed to just ignore the situation and accept defeat from the apartheid government because of this? There was need for a new way of resisting apartheid. Given now that the people knew that if you do violent protests, the government is going to ban you and the government is going to arrest you, is going to detain you, or you end up being in exile. Then there was need for a new orderly way of resistance to apartheid. That way came in the sense of Black consciousness movement. That was the newly invented way of challenging apartheid. And what was it? It was a new way of life for the Black community, which was fighting for psychological liberation. That is the background that you're supposed to talk about here, not any other background. And don't waste time on this because there are no marks for this. It's just background information to assist you, to assist the reader rather. And for that matter, the reader already knows what happened. You'll be wasting your time. Right, then what you need to, the other problem that you learners do, when you want to narrate series of events or chronological events in history, we don't start by the death of a key figure. Like even when you watch movies, have you seen the key figure in the film dying in the first 2 minutes? Is it going to continue? You start by Steve Biko was detained by the police and he died in police custody. Then how did he influence people to fight against the government when he was already dead? You must arrange your events in chronology of historical series. Start from the 1976 event. You cannot start with a 1993 event, then you go back to 1976. It doesn't make sense. Though you might not remember exactly the events according to their chronological time frame, but at least there must be a sense in your presentation of chronology, not just to be picking points which are where you're going to use evidence. You use evidence of the time frame, and the time frame is not in chronology, or you refer to an event later on which happened very earlier and which gave a spiral impact on the other events to follow. Right. So what you need to start with here, I'll just give you a highlight of how you can present your how can you write your essay. Start with the influence of Steve Biko in university and other university students, the likes of Moapi. Right. Them breaking away from the National Union of South African Students to form their own South African Students Organization. This was the first step of infusing learners with Black consciousness ideas. They broke away from an organization that was dominated by the whites and which was accepting apartheid practices. Because remember, there was this instance of separate amenities which was suggested by the University of Teflop. They decided to split learners according to race. They were supposed to have separate amenities for the white learners and for black student university for the black students. So that did not go well with the black students because they were attaining the same institution. But now the government is advocating that the very same students in the very same institution, they must not use the same amenities. We must have sleeping facilities for the whites and for the blacks. We must have eating facilities for the whites and for the blacks. Why were they splitting that? This was the first initiative which infuriated the black university students. They broke away from the students' union, which was representing them, which was dominated by the whites, which was accepting white practices, and formed their own, which was. And when you're explaining this, what was the implication here? You explain that because black learners had a common understanding, now, given they had the same students' union, their ideas were now easily implemented and would flourish. We have a common understanding, we have the common problem, and we are now in the same institution. It means automatically whatever we're going to discuss, we're going to agree. And whatever we're going to implement is going to be successful because we have a common sharing of the problems. Unlike you are trying to negotiate with the devil at the same time. They are fighting against you, you are trying to negotiate with them. Would you think will be successful in that instance? You won't succeed. So this is the first step that you need to explain, that the black learners, they broke away from the common students students union and formed their own union. And for that effect, it meant that their ideas were going to flourish because they were now having a common shared problem because of the apartheid practices. Right. Then, because of that, you can go on to explain the role of Black consciousness movement on Black South Africans in university. Now, there was a Black consciousness movement, its influence on Black South Africans. How was it influencing the thinking of Black South Africans? It was fighting for psychological liberation. If you take this one here, if you have information and you read widely, this is a paragraph that you can create. Black consciousness was targeting for psychological liberation of Black people. What are we saying here? Black people were supposed to adopt a new way of thinking. What was the new way? They were supposed to do away with the shackles of apartheid. They had accepted defeat from the apartheid government. Now they were supposed to change that. They were supposed to do away with apartheid. They were supposed to develop a new mindset, which made them believe that it was possible for them to defeat apartheid at some point in time. So you explain this, and because of this psychological liberation, Black people started to act with pride. Because now they were realizing their self-worth. They were also realizing that it's not only a matter of being white that will make you human. You're also human even if you are Black. So they started realizing their self-worth because of the psychological liberation, and because of them acting in pride, that gave them self-confidence. Then you can explain also on the influence of Black consciousness on bringing in unity amongst the oppressed groups of people in South Africa. Because remember, the term Black for Black consciousness was not referring to Africans. They were referring to any group of people or any race which was suppressed by the apartheid government. So the concept Black, you create another paragraph where you explain Black consciousness using the term Black to refer to the suppressed. The suppressed, we are referring to the two other groups, the Indians and the colors. How did it assist if Black consciousness was incorporating the two other races which were also suppressed? It meant it brought unity amongst these three races. And what was the implication of the unit which was brought? It strengthened the fight against apartheid. Because why the government was adopting a policy of ethnicity in its Group Areas Act, why were they doing that? Why were they splitting people into different ethnic groups? The Zulu were made to stay in their own homelands in KwaZulu. The Sotho were also made to stay in their own homeland. The Tswanas in their own homelands. It was a way of weakening the Black society. They were trying by all means to divide the African society so that it does not gain momentum in numbers. So for that sense, Black consciousness brought unity of the oppressed people, and then they became stronger, which meant that their challenge was felt by the government because now they were acting as a united front. You explain in that dimension. Right. Then you can also take the idea of Black consciousness infusing the Blacks with a sense of pride. This is where you incorporate the ideas of Black is beautiful. If you check the movies of the South African typical movies of the 70s to the 80s, Black South Africans were adopting that policy of Black is beautiful, whereby they were keeping that Black afro. They were no longer dressing their hair the white way. They were now keeping it the kinged way, the African way. And also they were advocating for the adoption of African traditional attire as a way of showing that we are also beautiful in the sense of our own Black. We cannot copy everything from the white society. We have to act with pride as a group of people, as a distinct society. We must also uphold our sense of pride. So how did it assist? People who are proud of themselves, they are confident. If you are doubting yourself, it meant that the apartheid government would do whatever it wanted. Because you don't have identity, you don't have pride in yourself, you don't have confidence. But because of the sense of pride, it assisted black people to challenge the government directly because of the infusion of the sense of pride, which was brought by the black consciousness ideology. So you explain and you create a full paragraph based on that. Then you can also talk of rejection of the sense of self-pity. You can create a paragraph on the rejection of the sense of self-pity. Right. This one, you can link it to the Viva Frelimo rallies, like indirectly, because it's a point on its own also. Right. How were black people supposed to reject a sense of self-pity? There were some black South Africans who had surrendered in the fight against apartheid. But however, because of the events that were happening around South Africa, in 1980, Zimbabwe got its independence. And earlier on, Mozambique was independent in 1978-79. It brought a sense to South Africans that it was possible to still reclaim their independence because neighboring countries were attaining their independence. So they started rejecting a sense of self-pity. They were feeling pity for themselves that we are suppressed, the government is doing whatever it wanted on us and we can't fight it, and then what is going to happen to our lives? People were exposed to the Bantu education, which was a disadvantage to generations until now. There are some people who are still unemployable in South Africa because they were exposed to a useless form of education. They were denied right to a decent education. And those people, even now, they are elderly people who don't have any skill, who don't have any knowledge. They don't know anything. Some of them can't even write because of the influence of the Bantu education. So for that sense, black South Africans were just having pity on themselves. They were feeling pity for themselves. They were just as good as they were second-class citizens. But however, they were supposed to reject that mind and start to think in another dimension. It was possible. Victory was possible for them. So you explain in those dimensions. Then you also need to explain the influence, the political liberation. You explain on black consciousness movement, on political organizations. Right. Here you can explain on student movements like the SAMS, SASIM, which was for high school. And you can also explain on BCM on SASO, which was for universities. Right. How did black consciousness got to effectively to be instituted in the schools? It was because of high school teachers and primary school teachers were partly, yes, influencing the learners. They were coming with those ideas from university. Remember, black consciousness was instituted in university and was continually instituted in university so that whoever was coming from university going to the society was going to come out with the idea and was going to spread the idea to the society and the community. Whereas for that matter, we had teachers who were coming from university, going to teach in the high schools. They were coming with the same idea from university and spreading it to the learners, such that it led to the Soweto uprising. It's because the learners were now infused to the ideas that we are being suppressed and we cannot let this situation continue. Let's find ways of challenging this form of governance, which is suppressive, which is oppressive, and which is segregatory. Right. Then you can also explain on political organizations, like you talk of the ANC and the PAC. Even though they were banned, but the spirit of continued fighting was resustained because of black consciousness. The ANC, most of them people were in exile, but however, they resumed the spirit of fighting because of the influence of black consciousness. Right. Then you can also talk of other aspects like, let us continue and look at other aspects. So you are seeing how you are balancing your argument. When you are answering a critical discussion, whichever format you want to use in your paragraphs, you can put maybe 2 paragraphs on one side of the argument, you put another on the other side. But as long as there is critique, there is balance in your presentation, you must address either side. Because remember our 2 sides, we want to look at political liberation, and also we want to look at the other dimensions of liberation. So we are looking at influence on political organizations like the ANC and the PAC, influence on student movements. It's a political organization, it's political liberalization. That is how you answer. You look at the other dimension of political, you look at that other dimension of social and psychological, you look on the dimension of economic liberation. Then you also look at, besides that, you look at the Viva Frelimo Morales is also another important element. The influence of Black consciousness on the Frelimo Morales of 1974. Right, what was this? It's a very important aspect because it brought hope to South Africans and it brought unity to South Africans. Black consciousness, it introduced what were called, it organized rallies. These rallies were meant to celebrate the attainment of independence in Mozambique in 1974. Why were they doing rallies in South Africa and yet the celebrations were supposed to be done in Mozambique? Independence was realized in Mozambique. The very shared struggle that Mozambique had was the very same struggle that South Africa was having. So it gave people hope that at any particular point in time, independence was on its way to South Africa. If Mozambique had managed to attain its independence, and some 6 years later it was Zimbabwe, and we understand Namibia was also granted independence after the Angola civil dispute. So you see, the trend in the region was in a way which was positive for Africans. They were gaining confidence that if neighboring countries are getting their independence, then who is next? As we are also going to get independence. So they were organizing rallies to celebrate on behalf of the attainment of independence of other African states. How did it impact on the government? The government was now feeling threatened because these other neighboring countries, they were going to support the South Africans who were in exile because they were now having independence. Why South Africa? I think you still remember when we looked at the involvement of South Africa in Angola. It was because South Africa was fearing that Angola was going to protect the exiles from South Africa. If communism was going to come to Angola, they were going to protect the exiles from South Africa and they were going to stage an attack from Angola. So they were trying to destabilize Angola so that the exiles would not find a way of reassembling and staging another attack on the government. The same way South Africans were celebrating independence of the neighboring states, the government felt very threatened because now they knew if the trend is falling in the region, then who is next? They were going to lose South Africa. They were going to lose control of South Africa very soon because it was now a regional trend. Right. So that is another way that you check on Black consciousness, organizing the rallies to unite people and to celebrate and to show the government that independence is also coming into South Africa. It's not only in Mozambique, it's also coming to South Africa. Right. Then you check on other things like the Black People's Convention. It's another important concept that you need to develop into a paragraph. The BPC. Right. Most of you, when you focus on this, I don't know if it's you are religious or what, do not focus on the churches because the Black People's Convention, it included churches but was not a church organization. There was no worshiping done there. It was a collective organization which was made of civic organizations, including churches. Civic organization, we are talking of society organizations which are not inclined to anything, like burial societies, like drinking clubs, like whatever. Those are civic organizations. They were coming together to share the ideas of Black consciousness and to help uplift the spirit of each other to fight against the government. So the Black People's Convention, it was an organization of civic societies who apparently came together to influence each other and share ideas of Black consciousness and find effective ways of fighting against the government. So because of this gathering here, the government was very threatened. They were now seeing that Black people are now uniting because it also brought unity amongst the people. The BPC was taking people from different perspectives of life, from the African townships, from the colored areas, from the Indian areas. They were now able to come together for a common purpose. And it meant that the government was being threatened to see people uniting for a common cause, which was fighting against the very same government, which was an oppressive government. So you explain how the BPC influenced the unit of civic society organizations and how it threatened the government. The government was now feeling that the societies are fighting from a united front, and therefore their ability to control a united front was now limited because of the numbers who were having a shared understanding. Then you also explain on other things like influence of Black consciousness on labor. This is a very important concept that you must never forget when you're writing this essay. Right. How did Black consciousness influence labor? We are looking at the labor situation which Black people were exposed to pre-Black consciousness. Black people were exposed to inequality in the workplace. They were discriminated. They received poor pay for performing their duties. They were restricted because of the color bar. They could not occupy some positions. There were some positions reserved for the white people. So there was very unfair treatment of the black person in the labor force. So because of black consciousness, it influenced black people to fight for their rights in the workplace. Things like discrimination in the workplace, they were supposed to come to an end. You cannot discriminate me in the workplace because I'm black. Or you cannot introduce color bar that we cannot have a black engineer in the workplace. Well, at least I can qualify for that. So that was supposed to come to an end because people were now infused with black consciousness ideas. They started to challenge the employers directly. And also remember, some black people, because the apartheid government was now reforming, were working for the government. They were now also deliberately engaging in stayaways as a way of showing their discontent. We deliberately stay away from the workplace so that you address what we want or you conform to what we want. So because of that, it gave a very big negative economic impact on the government. People were engaging in stayaways, people were engaging in strikes, people were engaging in rolling mass action in the labor force. So because of that, it gave a very strong implication on the economic performance of the government in terms of running the economy. And here you can also check on important aspects that you can give as distinct paragraphs. We have the influence of black consciousness on the Durban tile workers. Was a major strike, which was the initial strike to be noted in South Africa. Trade unionism, remember, was disallowed. Black people were not supposed to be part of trade unionism. They were not supposed to join any trade union. But however, because of the relaxations and the reforms, the government ended up relaxing some of those measures and allowed black people to form trade unions. Those trade unions, they influenced black workers to fight for their rights and gave rise to one major common strike like the Durban Tile Workers Strike, which was the major strike in South Africa and the major first strike, which is still notable in the history of South Africa. So you explain how black consciousness influenced trade unions to mobilize workers to fight for their rights in the workplace, and how it affected the employers and how it weakened the apartheid government. Right. Then we can also talk of the Black Allied Workers Union. It was also a key player in the implementation of black consciousness on labor. The Black Allied Workers Union, which was formed to conscientize black workers on the need to fight for their rights in the workplace and not just relax. Right. Then we can also go to economic liberation. I will end with economic liberation. Then I will go to the banishment of Steve Biko in the King Williamstown. Right. On economic liberation, you need to talk of community projects here. Black people were relying on support from the government, but however, the government was not willing to support black people. The government had already implemented measures which were segregatory so that they would apply a policy of separate development. Why they were doing segregation? It was to easily apply a policy of separate development. In terms of amenities, there were areas for black people, like you can talk of the train sections. Trains were segregated. There were areas, there were certain sections where the Europeans were exclusively supposed to occupy, and areas where non-Europeans were supposed to exclusively also occupy. It made it easy for the government to implement separate development. They would upgrade the facilities for the Europeans and neglect the facilities for the blacks. Or even in other public facilities, like you can talk of the beach facilities, you can talk of the parks, they were all segregated. Areas that were supposed to be used by the Africans were neglected, while these areas were used by the whites were maintained. Same with residential areas. Areas for the whites had better infrastructure, had good roads, had good public facilities like libraries and community halls, while the black townships did not have anything. Some of them, even up to now, they still have the gravel roads, they still have very poorly developed infrastructure. It was because of the policy of separate development. So what were black people supposed to do? They were supposed to find a way of emancipating themselves economically. So because of that, the black people who were learned by then, who got a chance to achieve better education, who had managed to learn out of South Africa, most of them, they started chipping in South Africa to assist the black community. Their major purpose was to upgrade the level of education of the South African child. And they initiated what were called the winter school programs. They were trying to do away with the Bantu education. Remember, they knew well that if black South Africans continue with this system of education, they were not going to go anywhere. You are trained to work for the white person. You go to school, you do agriculture. You go to school, you do carpentry. You go to school, you do welding. You don't learn an academic subject. You don't know even maths. You don't know English. You only know how to work for the white men. So where were they going with that kind of education? So those who were learned by then, they saw that if we continue with this system and we don't intervene, we'll end up being a lost society. So they chipped in and introduced those who were educated. They were voluntarily teaching the fellow black child through the winter school programs. These were initiatives, and also there were other communities. And the examples are there. If you check in your textbooks, there are several examples. You can check on the examples of winter school programs to give evidence. Community programs, you can also check on them. Like there's an MP law. Most of them, they were in Eastern Cape. There were community health programs and also community developmental projects. Then you can also talk of the community trusts. All these are economic emancipation measures that were taken by the black consciousness. Then, besides this, you can go to 1976 and talk of the Soweto uprising. Right, because of the Bantu education system, the government was used to control black people and do whatever they wanted with the black children in school. So they instituted what was called the statutory instrument 50/50. This statutory instrument was stipulating that all subjects in school were supposed to be learned in Afrikaans. So Afrikaans was introduced as what we call the medium of instruction, which meant that all learners in school, they were supposed to learn in Afrikaans. If they were doing agriculture, they were supposed to do agriculture in Afrikaans. If they were doing woodwork, they were supposed to learn woodwork in Afrikaans. So because of the effect of black consciousness, the black learners, they felt this was a continued suppression. Why would we use an oppressor's language to learn? And what is going to happen to our own native languages if we are now learning in Afrikaans? Are we still going to continue with our native languages? And where are we going to go with this Afrikaans? Afrikaans, remember, is only a South African language. So if you specialize in local language in a country, and then your exposure is limited. So they fought against the idea. And unfortunately, in the fight, it started as non-violent protests. But however, the police, The white police security forces, they were always reacting violently whenever there was a protest or a demonstration. They ended up firing on innocent civilians, for that matter, school learners. And that gave us, that gave rise to the Common Youth Day in South Africa, which is the 16th of June. That is when the Soweto uprising was initiated on the 16th of June, 1976. And the common figure, Hector Peterson. Right, so that takes us to the end of our discussion. What you need to do when you are concluding your discussion, remember a discussion must be concluded based on tangible evidence. You must reach a conclusion based on evidence. For you to be able to conclude your essay, there must be evidence in the essay to support that whatever you were saying was answering the question. So usually what will make you lose marks is you reach a conclusion without evidence. For you to be able to say the matriculants of 2025 are going to fail, for you to reach a conclusion that they are going to fail, what must you see? There must be evidence. Maybe they don't attend classes, they don't listen in class, they come to school late, they don't come to school on weekends, they don't attend extra classes. Then you can safely conclude that this class is going to fail. You can only reach a conclusion based on evidence, which means if you write 3 points, you cannot safely conclude with 3 points. That is a conclusion which is not contextualized. You cannot reach a conclusion when there's no evidence. You have to reach a conclusion, which means your argument must have substance. It must have convincing evidence, such that your level for presentation is minimum level 6, and your level for content coverage is minimum level 6. If you get level 6, that will give you not less than 40 out of 50. That is a very good mark for your essay. But if your presentation is poor, you don't contextualize your paragraphs, you don't link your paragraphs, or you repeat the same link, you create a chorus as if you are singing, then your presentation will be around presentation 4, largely descriptive. And your content, if there is content which is not narrative, but if you are narrating without facts and without evidence, then it means also your presentation is going to be poor. And if you get a presentation poor and a content poor, then it means you can get some